The title of tonight's lecture is up here for you to see. What if alcohol were not as socially costly as everyone says? And it's both a pleasure and a privilege to introduce Dr. Eric Crampton, this evening's speaker. Dr. Crampton is a senior lecturer in economics here at the University of Canterbury. He joined the department 9 years ago after graduating from George Mason University in Virginia, where he specialized in public choice economics. That is the application of economic tools to the study of politics and also public policy issues. Since arriving at Canterbury, Eric has combined academic research in the history of economic thought, constitutional political economy, and public choice, with policy work taking a more public focus. He's published widely in journals including the Journal of Politics and Public Choice. As many of you will probably be aware already, Eric is also one of Canterbury's public intellectuals, taking seriously the university's role as both creator and also disseminator of knowledge, not just within the university, but more generally within the community. His policy-oriented work on alcohol and also on minimum wages has featured in parliamentary debates, in the pages of the National Business Review, and on Radio New Zealand. He's contributed to the opinion pages of most New Zealand newspapers and also some Australian newspapers, and I'm sure many of us in the room have already read some of those articles. He's also provided commentary on his work for Radio New Zealand, as well as the Australian and Canadian broadcasting companies. In 2009, Eric started blogging at offsetting behaviour. And since then, his blog has become securely established as New Zealand's leading academic economics blog. It's attracted over 350,000 visits, links from top international sites, including Marginal Revolution, Andrew Sullivan's Daily Dish, Econlog, Slate, Crooked Timber, and the Toronto Globe and Mail's Economy Lab. It's also attracted kudos from Air New Zealand's In-Flight magazine. Tonight, Eric will introduce us to some of the international literature on alcohol's social costs, and also his own thoughts and work on this subject. So please join me in welcoming Eric to the podium. I should add that Eric's very happy to answer questions. I'm sure there will be questions, and I think you'd probably like to take them at the end.
Of course. Yes, I'll take them at the end. The first one that I'll deal with right at the beginning, though, unfortunately, that isn't entirely my publication record. Those are some of the places my work has been cited.
Okay.
I will eventually be published in the Journal of Politics, but I'm not there yet. But tonight I'm going to be talking about alcohol's social cost. It's an area that interests me particularly because of my work in public choice, where I look at how voter preferences affect public policy. And I worry that a lot of the public discourse around alcohol has gotten a little bit inflammatory, and that it has started negatively affecting policy. So that's where I'd started coming into it. And I'd also started coming into it because of an interest in one particular measure of alcohol's social cost here in New Zealand. I'll come to that soon. But first, let's just try and situate things a bit and see, well, is there really much of a crisis here? What if there really weren't one? Things on the whole aren't all that bad. It's hard to open a newspaper without finding some new horrible thing that has happened because of some person who has misused alcohol. A lot of those costs are very real, but on the whole, it is difficult to make a case that New Zealand either has had a spectacular increase in alcohol-related problems recently, or that we are out of line internationally. And I'll point to both of these. Here we are. So, is New Zealand consumption out of line? And not so much, I will argue. Let's start by looking at some of the popular discourse around it. What about the stuff that we hear? So the New Zealand Drug Foundation, I'm not meaning to pick on them in particular, their data is easily found. They're one of the better ones that are out there, actually. But this is one of the myths that they sought to bust in their submission on the recent changes to New Zealand's alcohol legislation subsequent to the Law Commission's review. So they point out that total alcohol available for consumption increased by 9.4%, and that this increase coincided with some liberalization of our liquor laws. Well, you look at that and you say, well, a 10% increase almost. Surely that's something bad. Should worry about this. Well, you got to be careful with trends. First off, it's awfully easy to make a scary graph, and the Drug Foundation did not put this one up, but other people have. I've seen it around. I reconstructed it out of Stats New Zealand data, and this data is definitely true. This is per capita alcohol available for consumption out of the Statistics New Zealand data series that's publicly available to anybody who wishes to put the numbers together and throw it into a Google Docs chart. And boy, that's a sharp increase, eh? That's pretty scary. I get worried when I see graphs that look like that. But I get worried about them for a different reason. One of the reasons that we're not looking at the baseline. Baseline isn't that bad. So if we're just looking at 98 to 2012, we have had this mild increase. And here you'll note also that I put this in per capita terms rather than in just straight total terms. Population has been increasing. We might consider that that matters as well. But even that, slight increase over time. Maybe it's because of liberalization. Or maybe we need to add a few years to the data series. Most Stats New Zealand data goes back to 1986 if you go into InfoShare. It is hard to find series that don't start there. There are some that don't start there. But your baseline expectation is that anything reporting results out of Statistics New Zealand should be giving you data back through 1986. If it isn't, there's either something weird with that data series, or the person putting it up didn't think the prior data was relevant, or the person putting up didn't want you to see the prior data. And it's also interesting to note that New Zealand's real liberalization in alcohol policy started around 1989, not in the last decade. In fact, it's very arguable whether the more significant liberalization happened in 1989 or in 1999. We can go through some of the timeline. And again, this is courtesy of the New Zealand Drug Foundation, who are very good on some of this. So 1989's liberalization, we moved to 24-hour bars. We didn't have forced closing time. You can see the drop since '89. We moved to increase the number of licenses. The New Zealand Drug Foundation points out that the number of liquor licenses doubled in the period through the early 1990s from that liberalization. Again, you can look at that time trend. Wine started being available for sale in supermarkets over the same period. Come 1992, you could start having brand advertising on television after 9 p.m. 1995, cafes started applying for licenses. The 1999 liberalizations reduced the drinking age down from 20 to 18, or the purchase age, pardon me, and supermarkets were then also allowed to sell beer in addition to wine. So if we look at the overall time trend there, it is hard to see much evidence that justifies calls for there being a drinking crisis currently in New Zealand. You could say that overall drinking levels are very high, if you think that that is a high level, but it is hard to say that per capita consumption justifies scaremongering about things now being horrible compared to where they were 20 years ago. Now, if you extend the data series even further back, which you cannot easily do out of InfoShare, you can find that there was even higher levels of drinking than that through the early 80s and late 70s, and then was lower than this in the 1950s. But that isn't easily available through InfoShare. So it's hard on the time trend to see much evidence of this big increase in consumption that would be driving a whole pile of legislative changes. Well, maybe it's something else about it. Maybe it's youth drinking. So this was just out in Fairfax News last week in a variety of different sources. It's pretty hard to pin down where exactly that came from because journalists are terrible about citing where they actually got the numbers. and some of the people who put up the numbers are terrible about actually sharing them. So this looks like it came from the Harm to Harmony conference, which was an alcohol harm-related conference that was held recently by those who like to worry about alcohol's harms. And they are pointing, I like to worry about alcohol's harms as well, but folks who are a little bit more skeptical about the aggregate harms don't go to these conferences. They're finding some increases in binge drinking among females. Now, I couldn't find that survey anywhere to be able to check back the data on it, and others who have tried to get the data say that they've not been able to yet because the paper isn't available. But what we do have is ALEC's Youth Drinking Monitor, the Alcohol Advisory Council. So here, we can look back from 1998 to 2000, and then 2009, 2010, to see what's been going on with youth drinking. Now, it's a little hard to compare across age categories because they aggregate things differently in the different years, and there's not much I can do about that. But what I can do is put up the different age categories and let you make your own weighted assessment of how things are looking. So in 1998, a quarter of those aged 14 to 18 were not drinking. That number dropped in 2000. By 2009, 2010, they're not, that was the survey year. It's hard for me to get a weighted average of those three age cohorts that would sum up to things being worse now than they were in 1998, but maybe you can do it. It would require there being a whole lot of 18-year-olds and hardly any 15 to 17-year-olds. I don't think that the demographic data supports that, but I've not backed it out on my own yet because that'll be another afternoon's work that I've not had time to put in. But it would be exceedingly surprising if we got to a cohort of non-drinkers of 14 to 18-year-olds that were much smaller than the 25% we were seeing prior to the change in the drinking age, or the alcohol purchase age. Well, again, maybe it's not the teetotalers that are the problem, it's the binge drinkers. That's the ones that the current crisis that we're all worried about. In 1998, same ALEC report, and again, got the problems with the age cohorts. Roughly a third were reporting that they were drinking more than 5 drinks in their last reported drinking session. Here again, less than that among 15 to 17-year-olds in the most recent survey, more than that among 18 to 24-year-olds. Maybe once you weight those, you're going to get things around a third, maybe a little over a third, but I'm having a hard time seeing much evidence there again of something big and horrible going on in youth drinking compared to where it was in 1998 prior to the alcohol purchase age change. So on the basis of this, around the time that Parliament was voting on, or in the lead up to Parliament's votes on changing the alcohol purchase age, I had a bit of media commentary just pointing out these numbers, saying, well, it's pretty hard to build a case for that there are substantially worsened outcomes since the alcohol purchase age changed. And usefully, since then, Professor of Economics Steve Stillman had a few things to contribute, but we'll look at a few other bits of data. This is from the Ministry of Social Development Social Report. They run this not every year. These are the years for which they've provided data. This is out of the most recent one, which was done a couple of years ago. They've not updated it since, unfortunately. And here, again, unfortunately, they're only looking at 15 to 24-year-olds. I don't have a finer grained breakdown than this. But let's take a look at it. Prior to the change in the alcohol purchase age, from 20 to 18, about 40% or 41% of youths aged 15 to 24 were having potentially harmful drinking. I'll tell you what that means shortly. 2002, 2003, that dropped a little bit, and then it came back up 2006, 2007. I look at a table like that, and I say, white noise around a mean. I don't see any kind of trend there. Again, it's possible to say that this is just unacceptably high, and it has been for a very long time, but that is different from saying that there is some current crisis that demands immediate action. And it's kind of the same for the other age cohorts, too. There's not a whole lot of there. Now, why might those numbers be so high? Well, what gets to count as potentially hazardous drinking ain't hard to achieve. It comes out of the audit test A score of 8 or higher on the 10 questions, where you can get up to 4 points per question, tells you that you are a potentially hazardous drinker. I ran through it myself just to see how badly off I was, and luckily I came up with a 7 rather than an 8, so I don't need to worry. But I'm not sure that I either would have had to worry much if I'd reached an 8. Let's look why. My wife Susan and I share a bottle of beer or have a glass of wine with dinner each and every night. It is the rare night that we do not do this. I prefer craft beers. I've got a few that are my favorites. Won't get into plugging them now, but I have that every night. So I get 4 points for that. That gets me halfway to being a potentially harmful drinker. I get 1 point for typically having, well, I have a little less than 2 standard drinks per night. If it were just 1, that wouldn't give me a point. If I had to guess, it'd be maybe closer to 1.4, but we'll call it 2. Now, 2 standard drinks isn't a whole lot. It's pretty easy to reach that. In fact, a bottle of many of my preferred craft beer will reach the 2 standard drink threshold. Had I reached 3, then I would have gotten 2 points, and I would have been a problem drinker. We will come soon to what the health harms are from having 3 standard drinks per night. They're negative. I also got 1 point for having 6+ drinks less than monthly. A few times a year, I will have, maybe 3 pints of decent beer. 3 pints of decent beer is 6 standard drinks. If your typical drinking pattern has a glass of wine with dinner every night, or up to, say, even up to 3 standard drinks. 3 standard drinks, that would be a pint of good beer and maybe a glass of wine later. And having 3 pints of good beer less than monthly. I got 0 points because I never have to drink in the morning to face the day. Haven't gotten there yet. And I give myself a point for regretting things done while drinking less than monthly. I've never regretted anything, or at least not recently, not since age 20 or so. Not regretted things done subsequent to drinking any more than I regret things done subsequent to not drinking. But I screw up a lot, whether I'm drinking or not. And I would have figured it was not quite fair to give myself 0 on that. I got 0 points because I don't black out after drinking and suffer memory loss. I don't cause or suffer injuries, and I haven't been told by anyone in particular, other than general calls in the media, that everyone should cut down. I've not been told personally to cut down. So I luckily add up to 7, but it would have been pretty easy to hit 8. And that is why you can get such substantial portions of the New Zealand population being potentially harmful drinkers. Now, this is an ugly table. It is not my table. I cannot claim credit for this research. This comes from Stephen Stillman. He's Prof of Economics down at the University of Otago. And he's been doing some interesting work looking at the effects of the change in the alcohol purchase age from 20 to 18. So this here reports results from a difference in difference estimation from data coming out of the New Zealand health system. And what difference in difference estimation does is it says, let's imagine that the trends among youths followed the trends that happened among 22 and 23-year-olds, except for that we had this change. So if we didn't have the change in the purchase age, whatever was happening among 15 to 18-year-olds, or sorry, 15 to 17-year-olds here, and then 18 to 19, 20, 21, whatever was going on with them would have just followed what was going on with 22 and 23-year-olds. And that's a nice way of controlling for that, well, maybe other things have happened over time. Maybe prices have changed, maybe availability's gotten easier, maybe just the culture's changed. We can just try and look and see what's happening to a group that shouldn't have been affected by the change in the purchase age and use that as a measure of what we would have expected to have happened to these other age cohorts, except for that we had a law change. And what does he find here? I will put the mouse up here, and I apologize for this. He finds a 10 percentage point reduction in injuries related to drinking among 15 to 17-year-olds subsequent to the law change. Again, this is relative to what we would have expected them to have had given what happened with the older age cohorts. He finds reductions in binge drinking. I'm highlighting the ones that were statistically significant as well as seemingly meaningful. The difference in difference estimation results here tell us that had binge drinking rates among 15 to 17-year-olds followed the same path as that for 22 and 23-year-olds, we would have had about 12,000 more kids reporting binge drinking. It is hard to make the case that changes in the alcohol purchase age made things worse for the younger cohorts. How about other measures? We had about 7,300 fewer people presenting at ED with injuries than we would have expected given the trends among 22 and 23-year-olds. It's very easy to find emergency room doctors who will rightly complain about the hassle imposed by drunks and the dismay at seeing drunk kids. It is harder to say that this is because of the change in the purchase age. And one not unreasonable solution for dealing with the cost in the emergency room is to have drunk tanks, but we'll perhaps talk about that later. And these are the models that had full controls, and those are the ones that from which I was citing. So those are some of the measures. We see no increase in drinking alcohol. We see no increase in the frequency of drinking. If we look at the number of drinks per session of drinking, 15 to 17-year-olds by 2006, 2007 were drinking 1 standard drink less per drinking session than we would have expected given the trend among the older cohort. Now that matters because the average is about 3 drinks per session. That's a pretty big change. Things aren't as bad as we are always told. Another measure, traffic accidents with alcohol involvement. This is a different kind of measure, again from Steve Stillman. I'm stealing his graphs that he kindly provided me that I blogged on, and I'm putting them up here. This is using a regression discontinuity design to see if there's a different trend before and after the change. We shouldn't have expected anything really for the 20, 21-year-olds and 22, 23-year-olds. Here we see a drop immediately following the alcohol purchase age change, followed by a slight rise. For 18 and 19-year-olds, those are the ones who were then able to purchase alcohol. If you use age-specific time trends, you get really nothing out of this. If you, according to Stephen, if you don't have those in, then you can back out about 1 more accident per year for 15 to 17-year-olds, and about 3.5 more accidents per year for 18 and 19-year-olds. Every accident is tragic, but we weigh the costs of those against the consumption benefits of the thousands and thousands of 18 and 19-year-olds who are now able to access alcohol responsibly. Other measures. Hospital admissions related to alcohol use disorder, those did go up, and the proportionate change looks large, but if we put that down to actual numbers, it's about 3 people per year by the difference in difference measure, or about 2 people per month by the regression discontinuity design. Again, every one of those is tragic, but it's not this big, huge thing. So, the time trend, hard to find much evidence of any great, big, horrible thing going on in New Zealand now compared to previously. But we could back up and say, well, maybe the problem isn't the time trend. Maybe it's that we are out of step with everybody else in the world, and we're just terrible, and we've always been terrible. Maybe we could tell ourselves that until we look at this. Again, there's no there there. This is coming from The Economist. They do the pretty graphs. The data comes from the World Health Organization. They have a survey of number of liters per person. Same data that I was putting up earlier. And if you look at that map, we are shaded slightly lighter than Australia. That depends on what year we're choosing. We came up above 10 liters recently and then went back down again below 10 liters recently. We kind of bounce around that line currently. We're not near the upper end of that range. But we are not that far out of line with a whole lot of the world. And a lot of the world that's shaded in the lightest colors do things to people who drink alcohol or are caught doing it that we would find unconscionable here. There are severe penalties for being in possession of alcohol in many Muslim countries. So we probably shouldn't be looking to those as being relevant comparisons for us. Things here are simply not that remarkable. If we look at their aggregate data, We are 38th among 188 countries in total consumption. Keep in mind that consumption is effectively illegal in a lot of countries. Not clear that we should be taking those as part of our baseline. If we sort it instead of consumption per capita, because we've got a lot of non-drinkers, they've got another measure that tries to get the consumption among those who do drink. And there, if we weigh ourselves internationally, 89 of 131 countries are consuming more alcohol per person who's drinking than we are. Okay, I suppose we could next say that the whole darn world's out of order. And you could argue that, but it is hard to make the case for there being any current crisis in New Zealand or any long-standing crisis in particular in New Zealand. So who drinks more than us? Here are all the countries that drink more than us. You can tell me whether these are just horrible places where you wouldn't want to live, or whether they are places to which we might well compare ourselves internationally. Keep hearing great things about some of these, like Finland, that just keeps coming up as being like this great place, and they drink more than us. Most of Europe drinks more than us. It's not like this is all like former Soviet Union or something. Lots of civilized places drink a fair bit of alcohol. New Zealand is not out of line. And those are presented in numerical order from the 2009 data. So the Czech Republic came in first on that one. And then Latvia was the one that was closest to us. You can download the WHO data online. Check it out for yourself. So, I have a hard time seeing any particular basis for there being a big crisis in current consumption, or a big crisis in New Zealand compared to the rest of the world. Other people disagree. I look at what Stats New Zealand says and what WHO says, and I'm not seeing much there. Now, what if the costs of what we are drinking are overstated? And this is where I really got interested in this area. There was an economic consultancy called Business and Economic Research Limited, Burrell, and they produced a report a few years ago claiming that the social costs of alcohol were really, really high. It had the social costs of combined alcohol and other drug use about $5.3 billion. If you looked at alcohol by itself, it's $4.8 billion. First thing you should do when you hear a number like that is remember how big New Zealand is. We got like, what, 4.4 million people, so they're saying it's more than $1,000 a head. Alarm bells should start ringing when you hear numbers like that. Is it plausible that it's more than $1,000 in social cost per person in the country? Isn't to me. But I just kind of shrugged it off. There's a lot of nonsense consultancy reports that get produced for one reason or another. And if you spent all of your time trying to debunk all of them, you would have no time left. So I just kind of shrugged my shoulders at it. And the disclaimer that I will also note is I have done some industry-funded work in this area looking at alcohol social cost in Australia. That came after I'd produced this. My initial work in this area, well, I'll get into the differences on that soon, but the net effect of my having done funded work is that I increased the measure of alcohol social cost in New Zealand by a couple $100 million. My first work had an error in it that I since corrected. So alcohol does not cost New Zealand $4.8 or $5.3 billion. Not at all. And this is why I started caring about it. Sir Geoffrey Palmer is the head of the New Zealand Law Commission, and as part of his review of the alcohol legislation, he had an address to the New Zealand police at one of their breakfast dues where he was giving some of the reasons motivating his fervor on alcohol and why something had to be done. So you can read that for yourself, but we'll note a couple of things about marginal cost and total cost a little later, and how the total measured cost of something don't necessarily have to equate to the collected excise revenue for things to be all hunky-dory. But he took the gap as being socially meaningful and policy relevant. That, okay, the 5.3, that's the one that was combining some of the joint costs between alcohol and other drug use. I only looked at the 4.8 billion because it's a bit of a nightmare to try and parse out the alcohol and other drug use figures, and the extent to which they inflated the one will be replicated in the other. So I only looked at the 4.8, but he figured that the big gap between the excise tax take and the measured social cost was sufficient reason for strong interventionist policy. Now, that's partially our fault in Econ 1, where we say, well, externalities give rise to social cost, and we want to put in Pigovian tax measures to try to redress that. So if the cost of my doing something, I bear some of it, I impose some cost on you, I'm going to do too much of it relative to what I should be doing, because I'm not caring about the cost on you. The social costs exceed the private cost, therefore we should have some regulation or taxation to try and bring the two into line. One, the aggregate cost doesn't necessarily reflect the margin, and two, the term social cost gets horribly, horribly abused once you get into consultancy reports. So we'll look at why that is the case. So here's what Burl included in their costs of alcohol in New Zealand. So loss of life, intangible costs. Now those are real costs too. Got to count those. 1.5 billion. 1.5 billion. Labor costs, close to 1.5 billion. Drug production costs. Look back at what that means. 700 million. Crime costs 562. That seems serious. Healthcare 290 million. Road crashes 200, and lost quality of life. I've got a typo there. That should be 48 million. Now let's go through those. Loss of life. How are we going to calculate that? Burl here was relying on a study done by Collins and Lapsley in Australia for measuring their costs for 2008. And Collins and Lapsley had a really nice etiological table, a table of etiological fractions. And what that table does is it tells you the proportion of the incidence of each type of disorder that's caused by alcohol. So if you look at alcohol-related liver cirrhosis, 100% of the cost of alcohol-related liver cirrhosis are due to alcohol. The alcohol-related part's kind of a clue to that in the title. Not all liver cirrhosis is alcohol-related, but that one certainly is. Accidents around the home, so that'll be in there. Suicide, that'll be one of the potential costs that'll come in the etiological table. But they also had a few other things in that table. There's some disorders where alcohol actually reduces the burden of disease. I'll talk more about those later. Coronary heart disease is a great big one. Huge one. And what Burl did when they got that table is they said, well, we have been asked to estimate the costs of harmful drug and alcohol use. It is by definition impossible that harmful use can have any benefit. Therefore, we will set equal to 0 every cell in that table where alcohol reduces the burden on the health system. Now that just ain't on. There are many levels of alcohol consumption where you will be imposing net harm on the tax system through, where you're costing the Ministry of Health a fair bit of money. But even if you're drinking like 7 or 8 standard drinks per day where you're experiencing real risk of dying too early, you're still having reduced risk of coronary heart disease. Big increases in risk of all kinds of other stuff, but if you're only counting the things that add cost, you're kind of skewing the figures. So I wasn't able to correct that in this data because they wouldn't give me their source stuff, and it would have been a pretty big job. So I just note that they assumed it away. The other problem is that most of these loss of life costs aren't what are normally considered an externality in economics. So when we worry about social costs diverging from private costs, we're worried about the costs that people are imposing on others. And we might also, if we take some of the more recent work in behavioral economics seriously, be worrying about the costs that people impose upon themselves by accident because of irrationalities or imperfect information or other issues of that sort. You can count some portion then of the increased cost that drinkers are themselves facing if you want, but you'd also have to be counting the benefits that drinkers experiencing similar risk enjoy from consumption. And they didn't count any of the benefits. So consequently, we netted out any of the costs that drinkers are imposing upon themselves. And only about 67 million was really coming from the costs that drinkers are imposing on others through alcohol-related crime or car crashes. Every one of those deaths is tragic. They are not a cost to the taxpayer. Those are different things. Oh boy, I think that they had it out of Daly's. So I think that they looked at lost life years. Labor costs. Now, Burl counted about 1.5 billion in labor costs. Now, there are many problems with this figure. Now, the biggest problem with this figure I'll come to at the end, the first one was that they effectively assumed that you could never, ever replace a worker who had died. Couldn't be replaced by another worker, couldn't be replaced by an improved process or a different process that used a machine instead of a worker. There was no way of replacing that worker. The next problem with it is that the number that they were using for the value of statistical lives came from the New Zealand's Ministry of Transport. New Zealand Ministry of Transport's figure on the value of statistical life is an inclusive figure. It includes all of the value that is lost when someone dies. How sad their families are, how sad they are, and lost production. It includes everything. If you look at the Ministry of Transport's annual reports looking at the cost of road accidents in New Zealand, they'll count lost production among those who are injured in car accidents, but they do not count lost production among those who die in car accidents because that is included in the cost of a statistical life lost. Putting both in is double counting. Thumb on the scales. And finally, that's a cost that falls primarily on the drinker. Wages you don't earn are wages that you don't earn. So we counted some costs that could plausibly fall on employers having to find somebody new, and on victims of alcohol-related crime and drink driving. Drug production costs. This is a fun one. What's a drug production cost? That's how much drinkers are spending on their alcohol. They count $700 million, or they counted $700 million of the cost that Geoff Palmer put up as something to be weighed against the aggregate excise tax take, including the excise taxes paid by drinkers, as a cost to the country. So that was a bit of a problem. That bit of it they did fix. They revised their figure subsequent to my giving them a bit of heck at the New Zealand Economic Association meetings that year. They didn't cite me for the correction, and they've been pretty quiet about it. Everybody keeps saying 4.8 or 5.3. Nobody's really noticed that Burrell retracted a little bit of that. But the way that they counted drinkers' own expenditures on alcohol as being a cost to the country was by assuming that each and every drinker who drinks more than 4 standard drinks per day, and women getting more than 2 standard drinks per day, got 0 gross benefit from any portion of their consumption. None! Oh, maybe you could easily argue 0 net benefit or even negative net benefit for some hardcore alcoholics. But no gross benefits? They're not getting any enjoyment out of it? It's kind of nuts. And it's a little out of line with more standard theory. Now, you can make a case out of behavioral economics that internality problems or information problems or problems in rationality make people drink more than they should, right? So say that I should only be drinking 3 drinks if I'm irrational, but I'm irrational, so I drink 5. The cost of those last 2 drinks are going to be higher than the benefits to me, so we could count that portion as being a cost. But that's different. We're not saying that all of my spending on all 5 drinks is irrational and counts for 0. Just that little bit. But that's not what they did. So we just wiped that out. Crime costs. Here's how they assess those. And this is a problem because crime costs are one of the things that are most plausibly a real social cost from harmful alcohol use, right? How'd they do it? There's a survey of prisoners in New Zealand. And they say, hey, how much did alcohol contribute to your offending? Not at all, a little, some, a lot, or all. If you answered one of the last 3 categories, that was an alcohol-caused crime. That would not have happened but for that people were drinking. Now, we thought that was a little nuts. Also, if judges are likely to show kind of lenience in parole hearings, oh, I'm sorry, I've turned my life around, it's because of the drink before. I'm not doing that now, I'm a changed man. Please give me parole. Maybe people are going to have some incentive to lie about how much they were to blame compared to alcohol. But yeah, they combined those crime factions out of that prisoner survey with Treasury's reasonable, reliable social costs of crime numbers. So Treasury has this great big document where they figure out, well, every murder costs this much, assault costs this much, theft costs this much. Times that by the fraction they got out of these prisoners, and that's your measured crime cost for New Zealand. Now, there are ways of doing this properly, but they're harder. Dale Carpenter does some work that does it a little more properly in the States. Healthcare costs, more reasonable, but they still zeroed out those ideological fractions where alcohol was reducing the cost. But this is also going to be problematic, right? Suppose that, as I'll argue later, the J-curve guys are right and that alcohol consumption at moderate levels increases life expectancy. If that is true, then living longer costs the government more money. I'm not quite sure how we want to end up weighing this stuff up. You could make an argument out of healthcare costs for something close to Logan's Run. Uh-oh, flashing. Gotta go get it eliminated. Road crash costs. Those are real. They botched some of the measurement of it. Now, these are road crash costs that weren't included elsewhere. So all the costs of death, that's already included in the death costs. Other costs included in the other costs we've looked at. This is mostly out of insurance overheads, but they seemed a little high relative to the total overhead of the insurance industry. If you look back at the Insurance Industry Council's numbers, they give some measures of overhead costs. They figured that 17% of the total insurance overhead costs for everything would disappear in the absence of alcohol-related road crashes, which seemed a little high. We scaled that back so it is somewhat proportional to road crash costs or incidents of alcohol-related road crashes. And then lost quality of life. Again, that was supposed to be in 42 million the first time around. About 24 million of that seemed to fall on people who are other than the drinker. Those are real external costs. Costs falling on the drinker himself are less standardly counted as plausibly social cost. So not much of that actually gets to count. And looking back at Geoff Palmer's, it just shakes my head when he's putting up a figure that includes part of the excise tax take as being larger than the excise tax take and consequently motivating policy. So that's one of the reasons I got involved in this. Correcting things, only about 967 million of Burrell's figure actually seems to correspond to what most economists would recognize as being relevant social costs. In my 2009 work on this, I had a lower figure. There was an error in that. My having done funded work for the Australian alcohol industry, looking more closely at Collins and Lapsley led me to find my error, the error that was not found by Burrell or by the Law Commission in the report that they commissioned to see what was wrong with what I'd said. They'd not found those errors, but I found them. So the consequence of my being funded is that I increased the measure for New Zealand. So, is alcohol really costing 4.8 billion? Not at all. 967 million, a little higher than the aggregate excise tax take, but again, the comparison of those is kind of irrelevant. I'll talk about those a bit when I come to policy. We need to assess things at the margin, in short. Felicity Barker did a really nice piece for New Zealand Treasury back in 2002 looking at aggregate alcohol excise and problems of social cost, and she very rightly noted there that with alcohol consumption, you've got a linear excise tax, so the more you drink, the more you pay, but harms are exponential. There's no harms from the first few drinks that people are having, but then the people who are having 10, 20 drinks a day are doing a whole pile of horrible things that are costing a whole lot. They're doing more harm than 20 times the harm done by somebody who's only drinking 1 drink per day. So you've got a linear excise tax, a nonlinear harm schedule, so you always will have excise regimes that are overcharging moderate drinkers and undercharging heavy drinkers. There is not much that you can do about that other than, if you want to issue drinking licenses and keep track of what everybody's drinking or something, but that runs into other very large problems. So we've got that issue. And we also have to measure policy effectiveness at the margin. Imagine that we'd found that alcohol social costs really were 5.3 billion or 4.8 billion and the excise tax were only 700 million. It could still easily be the case that the costs of reducing the harm are higher than the harm that's avoided. It depends how responsive moderate drinkers are to policy compared to harmful drinkers. On the other side, there can easily be interventions. Imagine if the social harms were far less than the aggregate alcohol excise tax take. There can still be things that we can do that do more good than harm because they have more effect on the harmful drinkers than they do on the moderate drinkers. We have to weigh things at the margin and not just point to these big, silly total cost numbers. The total cost figures are very good at inflaming public opinion and getting everybody thinking, oh, those drinkers are costing me money, therefore I want to beat up on them and increase the taxes. They aren't so good at telling us what policy should be. So, what if the costs are overstated? Well, they are. But what if benefits matter too? I like benefits. and all the benefits get to count, including that people enjoy drinking. It's easy to assume away consumption benefits, and a lot of people like to assume away consumption benefits. As economists, we can't do that. All the utils count equally. I am in no privileged position to tell whether your consumption benefits from doing the things that you like are better than the consumption benefits I get from doing the things that I like, so long as I'm not imposing costs on others while doing it. All the benefits get to count. But let's look at the health benefits a little more closely before thinking a little bit more about consumption. Is there a link between aggregate consumption and aggregate health outcomes? Well, there is. Now, the folks who like to worry us about alcohol like to point out in press, well, who remembers that alcohol causes cancer? It's a group 1 carcinogen along with plutonium. Nobody ever goes to Wikipedia and says, okay, what's all the list of group 1 carcinogens? And you get like wood dust and salted fish and estrogen-based hormone replacement therapy for those in menopause and estrogen-based birth control pills. Those are all group 1 carcinogens. Scary. Not quite as scary as plutonium, but one is a little more helpful than the other for motivating policy. So alcohol does contribute to many disorders, but it does alleviate a lot of other disorders. Heart disease, stroke, hypertension, type 2 diabetes for moderate consumption, dementia, and Alzheimer's and aging for moderate consumption. Those are reduced. We need some kind of measure that adds all of these things up, puts them in a big bucket, and says, well, what on net are we doing to ourselves? And we've got such a measure that adjusts, well, we do have the measure that adjusts for confounds. We'll come to the confounds. The aggregate measure is called the J-curve, and this has been well established in the literature for decades. The 2010 American Medical Association Dietary Guidelines say moderate drinkers have a 20 percentage point reduction in the risk of dying. Now, this is all source mortality. Well, what if drinkers are underestimating the risk of cancer? Who cares? We don't care about the incidence of specific disorders unless you have a specific family history that predisposes you to them. Otherwise, what you should care about is what happens on net. You're increasing your risk of some stuff, you're decreasing risk of the other stuff. Put it all in a big bucket, look at the J-curve. And when we zoom in on that, we see that men who are drinking up to about 4 standard drinks per day have lower risk of death from all sources than do teetotalers. For women, the cut point here, 2.5. Now, we will adjust that and bring it down a little bit shortly. But this is what the AMA was looking at. And if you take this gap down here, you get down to about 0.8 as a relative risk ratio. That means a 20 percentage point reduction in your risk of dying of anything. All source mortality, dying of anything. All right. But what about confounding? Now, we've got some problems here. And there were some very, very reasonable concerns that were raised about a decade, early 1990s, where they were worried, well, suppose that this is the case. Suppose that all of these non-drinkers that we're comparing people against as baseline, suppose that a lot of them are people who just got so sick because they were drinking too heavily that they had to quit drinking. Their doctor said, you are going to die if you keep drinking. You stop drinking today. And they listened. They say to the health surveyor, do you drink? Oh, no, I don't touch the stuff. If they're included among the non-drinkers, then we are massively overestimating the benefits of moderate levels of consumption, aren't we? That's a real and serious concern. It has been thoroughly answered in the literature. Okay, I'm an economist, but I can read the epidemiological literature. We use the same statistical techniques. Meta-studies are the same across all the disciplines. The New Zealand Ministry of Health worries a lot about this. The Drug Foundation put up a piece about 5 years ago calling the J-curve a myth because of these potential confounding issues. But these have been systematically answered. Let's look through it. The same source that gave the J-curve that I put up earlier, that was a nice meta-study by Di Castelnuovo, Donati et al., 2006. Further into the paper, they sorted those studies that might have screwed up, including former drinkers among their baseline, and those that excluded them. And we do see that we overestimate the benefits of moderate drinking if we include former drinkers among those who don't drink. Well, it seems pretty obvious, but we don't overestimate it that much. The cross point comes down here. This is an aggregate between men and women to a little under 3.5 standard drinks. And we're following the dark line here to get the good one that knocks out the ones that have former drinkers in the reference group. So we reduce the benefits down to about a 14 percentage point reduction in your risk of dying instead of 20, but it is still really real. Still there. We don't just have it with mortality. There was a very nice study came out of the States recently, the nurses cohort study, showing that among this great big cohort of nurses that they were following all the way through, moderate drinking in middle age predicts better outcomes in old age. You will be happier as an elderly person if you start now and are a moderate drinker. And this, again, this was designed to get around some of these potential health confounding issues. Their baseline included only people who were healthy in midlife. They excluded anybody who had recently quit drinking at midlife. So it started with a set of people who were healthy in midlife and who hadn't quit recently, or corrected for all these other health behaviors that they could find because they got measured on like exercise and all these other things that you might do. That's another potential confound, right? Maybe it's just that people who drink moderately also do a whole pile of other sensible things like exercise and eating a reasonable diet. You can correct for a lot of this stuff, and this study did. And a lot of these studies do. It's easy to wave your hand and say, well, there are these potential confounds, but you got to look to see how it's already been dealt with. Another nice one on that was some recent stuff by Eric Rim in the States looking at heart disease, again, very specifically designed to try and exclude these former drinkers and to correct for other health behaviors. He's finding substantial effects on coronary heart disease. And if we are going to worry about pervasive confounding, we have to worry about it both ways. We can't just worry about it one way. One of the ways that we might be potentially confounding things, suppose that people who like drinking in massive, excessive quantities are also people who like doing other very risky things for reasons other than the drinking. The same kinds of sensation-seeking behaviors or risk-taking propensities that make you a heavy drinker also make you more likely to do other ridiculous things. If that's the case, then a lot of the stuff that we're chalking up as costs of alcohol are actually, if we're not correcting for them, are actually costs of a risk type. That you are a kind of person who enjoys taking risks and will do so on a whole lot of margins. And if we are only sorting people by how heavily they drink without correcting for these other risk-taking behaviors, then we're kind of beating up on alcohol for nothing. It's just one of the things that they can do to exhibit risk-taking propensity. There was a fun study is in France. They were looking at people coming out of a bar, and they were counting the number of tattoos that each person had. And it turned out that the more tattoos you had, the higher your blood alcohol content coming out of the bar. Now, it's a little frivolous. Yeah, tattoos don't cause drinking or anything. Sometimes maybe drinking might have caused tattoos. But I think it just points to underlying risk preference, that some people like taking silly risks, and they'll exhibit that on all kinds of margins. Now, there are some real costs from heavy drinking, but some of it is just sorting out people between those who like taking risks and those who don't. Further, health isn't everything. There are all kinds of other good benefits from drinking. We can't just assume them away. Like sometimes when I talk about this stuff, I get hecked. Say, oh, are you saying that drinking's the only way to have a good time? Well, of course not. It's one of the things that many people choose to do as part of having a good time. Are you saying that they can't do something else? Well, of course they could do something else, but that they have chosen to do this tells me something, if I respect their autonomy. You look at some of the evidence, the psych literature, they'll talk about stress reduction, increased sociability. I'll talk a little bit more about earnings. There's some evidence coming up on intelligence correlating positively with drinking. And yeah, that's the Peel one. You can read that for yourself. Bit of an odd result, but that is what is seeming to come out. Further, the alcohol income puzzle. Chris Auld is econometrician out at the University of Victoria, applied econometrician. there is a long-standing finding in the alcohol literature that we call a puzzle because we don't really successfully know how to explain it. And the puzzle is this: teetotalers earn less than light to moderate to heavy drinkers. Even heavy drinkers out-earn non-drinkers. Now, the first thing you might say is, well, of course, very poor people, they can't afford to drink. Well, economists are a little smarter than that. We do know how to correct for that kind of thing, and it is included. After controlling for pretty much everything that he could throw into it, he was still finding very substantial income increases among light to moderate drinkers. Now, I've got speculations about why this might be the case. Nothing's really been proven yet. I think it has a lot to do with sociability and team building in business environments. That when you go out drinking with work colleagues, you reveal things about yourselves that let your colleagues trust you more. That's pure speculation, but that's my guess. If I had to have a first cut explanation. So, people enjoy drinking. We get moderate drinking brings health benefits. We can't assume them away. New Zealand's Ministry of Health and their dietary guidelines for older people, they continue to not look at the J-curve. I've given them a bit of heck about this because they cite all of these things raising concerns about the J-curve, these potential confounding things. So they cited Rim and Moats as raising questions about the J-curve. Rim and Moats was an exceptionally well-designed study in the States looking at coronary heart disease and proved that residual confounding was not driving results. Said, well, there's this worry about confounding. We'll test it. Actually, confounding isn't what causes it. The Ministry of Health was citing it as something that raises questions about the J-curve. What can you do? So what if benefits matter too? Well, you add them into policy. We have to account for that policies intended to reduce harmful drinking will also have effects on moderate drinking. If we count both of them, we get better policy. We evaluate policy, we always have to do it at the margin. How much do incremental changes do? We count benefits and cost. Oh, I rather like that aphorism. I tell it to my students in my current issues class. It only saves one life. It might be worth it. We don't know. A life is definitely worth something, but it isn't worth everything. And we all make decisions consistent with that every day. We don't all buy the safest car. We don't all use the safest measures of anything. We all take risks. We all trade off risks against other things that we hold dear each and every day. If that weren't true, we would all be driving cars made of Nerf at 20 kilometers an hour. So we trade off risks against other things, and one of those things are the consumption benefits enjoyed by moderate drinkers. To the extent that we curtail their consumption, we are doing real harm, and we have to take that into account when we are weighing up the harms from harmful drinking that we're trying to address. Broad-based policies, especially around price, are always also going to be affecting moderate drinkers as well as heavy drinkers. Now, it's true that heavy drinkers spend more, so of course they're going to be paying more in tax, but it's also true that they are one of the least responsive groups to prices. They care less about changes in price than do other groups. They adjust their consumption by proportionately less. The numbers up here are from a nice meta-study by Wagonar et al., where they combine the results of 112 different measures of alcohol's price elasticity. That's the amount by which consumption changes with a change in price. And moderate drinkers, if you get a 10% price increase, they cut back their consumption by 4.4%, heavy drinkers by only 2.8%. You hike prices, you will be doing more to curtail moderate drinkers drinking than you are to curtail heavy drinkers drinking. And you can actually end up doing harm just on this, even if you're only counting the health benefits. Remember that J-curve? If you're pushing a lot of moderate drinkers into not drinking at all, while not moving that far down the sharp side of that cost curve, you could end up doing more harm than good. I've not run the numbers on it yet, but it'd be a fun project to do sometime to see, to parameterize things, to see where you get the cut point between killing more people and not through price measures. And there was an Australian paper that came out this year by Burns et al. They were looking at price variation in Australia and how people changed not just their aggregate consumption, but their day-to-day consumption. Now, if one of the problems that we've got with aggregate alcohol consumption is that people concentrate it into binge sessions, well, maybe that's what we want to be trying to address more than aggregate consumption. Burns was finding that price hikes were increasing the number of days of non-drinking, decreasing the days of light drinking, and having no effect on the number of days of heavy drinking. Okay? my read of that, heavy, harmful drinkers were saving up for the weekends. Okay, they don't show that in the paper. You can't. They don't give the day by day, but that's how I read it. So we may be doing less to curtail harms than we might hope. If we look at minimum alcohol pricing, that's another potential price mechanism. Rather than just excise, I'd noted Barker's results that excise will always have these issues. Minimum pricing can potentially be a way around that. Chris Auld had a study out suggesting that if you combined a minimum alcohol price with a reduction in alcohol's excise tax, then that might be better than just having an excise. But that's going to depend a whole lot on how you weigh various things. And on this one, well, I'm going to have to be agnostic, and your own values are going to have to come into it a little bit. But while it is true that heavy drinkers choose cheaper products, so too do poorer drinkers. And a lot of the most harmful drinkers are going to be in the poor cohorts. So that might be a bit of a confound when we're just looking at the average amount that people are paying, sorted by whether they're heavy drinkers or not. Chris Auld, he'd found that a 10% increase in minimum prices in Canada was associated with about 3.4% reduction in consumption. Again, that's aggregate, and we don't know how much of that was consumption curtailed among moderate poor drinkers compared to harmful drinkers. How you weigh those off against each other is going to matter. We could monetize, we could sort it out, but it's not been done yet. Other things we can do for policy if costs and benefits matter. There's a lot of argument about whether we should have a 0.05 blood alcohol limit rather than 0.08. People on the one side say, well, here's a whole pile of car accidents, and here's how much you can drink to get up to 0.008. And the police have started keeping track on accident data of the proportion of people involved in accidents that were registering blood alcohol between 0.05 and 0.08. So we'll have some measure of the number of accidents involving those people. But that tells us nothing about policy, because we don't know how many people on the roads are between 0.05 and 0.08. If you show that there's X number of accidents, is that high, about what we'd expect, or low relative to the proportion of drivers on the road who are of that blood alcohol level and the overall accident rate? We simply won't be able to tell. So I need to start pushing the Minister of Transport more to start collecting that, see whether it can be done, whether it can be feasible. But if you wanted to do it properly, to assess whether it was worthwhile, have police collect it from every check stop. See whether somebody who blows under the limit is at 0.07, 0.06, 0.05, whatever. Get a time of day adjusted population cohort for people on the roads, and use that as your basis of estimation. If you reduce the drink driving limit, you will cut some drink driving related accidents, but you will also reduce consumption benefits among those who have some wine with dinner and then choose not to. We have to weigh both of those together. All the benefits get to count. Otherwise, we're driving the cars made of Nerf again. So I think that alcohol's social costs have been overstated, that there's no particular basis for thinking that New Zealand is out of line internationally or that we are out of line relative to some halcyon past, and that policy is the worse for it, that we have managed to work ourselves into a bit of a frenzy over alcohol, and that is driving a lot of demands for strengthened policy. There are some policies that can be done, or can be undertaken, that would have benefits in excess of cost. I strongly expect that some of what National is doing around some of the alcohol courts will be of this nature. You're there targeting the people who have demonstrated that they have serious problems with alcohol use and are trying to help them rather than imposing costs on everybody else. So that's a good thing. But otherwise, I worry that we're pushing ourselves into doing some serious harm to consumption benefits among moderate drinkers. And I'll be happy to take your questions.